Hi everyone, and welcome to lesson number 2 on persuasive writing as part of our climate change unit that we are now working on. So as you can see from the title up here today, your title is Persuasive Authors, and we're going to be learning about genre, audience and purpose as part of today's lesson. So you can see the objective here is going to be to analyse the legacy of persuasive authors, exploring how they match their genre to their audience and purpose for success. So for those of you who might not be familiar with that word legacy, it's over here. So legacy means the history which is passed on from generation to generation. So when I talk about the legacy of persuasive authors, what I'm talking about is the sort of historical trend for really successful persuasive speaking and persuasive writing. Now that goes back a hugely long way. We're talking right back to kind of Greeks, and we're going to look at the development of that from thousands of years ago up to the modern day, and thinking about how persuasive writing has been developed across the ages. So with that in mind, your first task is obviously to get down your title with persuasive authors, genre, audience and purpose, and then to have a go at the starter task A here. So this lesson we are going to begin with identifying the famous writers or speakers from the images that you can see running along the middle of your screen here. Okay, so I'm sure many of those will be immediately familiar to you. Some of them will probably be slightly less familiar. If you don't know, just leave it blank. But I'm looking for a list of names. So starting over here on the left and finishing over here on the right. If you're not sure, make an educated guess. Okay, pause the video there, guys. Okay, so at this point you should have had a go at naming the famous persuasive speakers and writers that you can see along the middle of our slide here. And once you've done that, I'm going to ask you to try and complete task B. I want you to see if you can rank them chronologically. So I'm looking for the one that was furthest back in history, running up to the most recent example here from history. Okay, so pause the video, see if you can rank them from oldest to newest. Okay, and pause. Right, so we're now going to have a go at the challenge before I go through the answers to the task with you. So for your challenge, you're answering C and D here. So C lists the qualities of a persuasive speech or piece of writing. So what do you consider to be the qualities of a persuasive speech or piece of writing? What should it do? What should it include? So create your list now and pause the video. So having created your list of the qualities of a good persuasive speech or piece of writing, you're now completing D from the challenge. Okay, so you're thinking about what words have the power to change the world. And so I'm thinking, do they have the power? Do they not have the power? What's your personal opinion on this? Do words have the ability to change the world? Now, whatever side of that argument you think you're going to take, you've got to be able to justify your point of view. So if you're going to argue no, words definitely don't have the power to change our world, then give me some reasons why. Why are words not enough? If you think yes, words definitely have, I'm thinking optimistically here, the ability to change our world, hopefully for the better, then you need to justify your answer for that as well. Where's the precedent for that? What's your proof that we can use words to change the world for the better? Okay, so jot down your answers now and pause the video, and then we'll go through the feedback for your starter tasks A and B. Okay, so we're actually going to start in slightly backward fashion by answering the challenge first. So I'm going to give you some feedback on the kind of things that you could have said. You'll need to grab a green pen to jot down any points that I might say now that you didn't include in your answer. So the question was, could you list the qualities of a persuasive speech or piece of writing? So some of the qualities that you may have included are things like the ability to really speak to to their audience. Now, we call that kind of addressing of you as a member of the audience direct address. So they directly address you as the audience. Okay, so that might be one thing that you would have said was part of the constituents of a really good persuasive piece of writing. You might also have said things like the ability to convey emotion. So don't forget, we talk about emotive language in English quite frequently in class, and that's using words which have this ability to kind of speak to our inner emotion, really convey our feelings and share that with other people. So you may have added that to your list of the qualities of a persuasive speech or piece of writing. Okay. Other things you could have included would be a really sound logical argument. So no one's going to just believe something on the basis that one person believes it to be true. So you want to have developed a really logical argument to be persuasive, and part of that means backing up whatever ideas you might be putting forward with evidence, so using facts or statistics to prove your point of view. You also might have included the fact that they might appeal to different parts of our nature, like they might appeal to our logic, our ability to be reasonable. They might appeal to credibility, so the fact that somebody who's of high status or who's well researched in a particular area has also suggested the same idea that they're putting forward, because that makes somebody sound more persuasive if they do that. Equally, they might appeal to our sense of what is right, so might appeal to our emotions and our sense of morality. So these are the kinds of ideas you may have put down for C. For D, do words have the power to change the world, or to challenge it? Actually, both would work. So for this one, the kind of things that I'd be expecting you to think about is great political speakers in the past who may have changed the direction of society. So I'm going to reveal one of the answers now to your starter task. So this middle figure here, smoking his cigar, is Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill famously makes a speech, so we're talking wartime Britain here, and his speech rallies the people together with this sense of Britain's strength and ability to overcome any disaster that it faces, including war. So I might use that as justification for an argument that actually words do have the power to change the world. They can bring people together, they can make people feel stronger, and as a result perhaps rally people to action. I might also cite examples of Barack Obama over here in his speeches that he has made, which have brought the nation together not only to understand his political decision making, but also to represent for people of colour the ability to rise to a position of power and authority in American culture. Okay, so what I'm looking for you to do for D is to use real life examples of people who have changed the world through their speech to justify the fact that yes, perhaps words do have the power to change the world. Obviously, you may have taken a completely different line of argument to me. I am in this very biased. I really do believe that words and English do have the ability to change the way that other people see the world for the better. You may have argued that they do not, and that it requires more than words. And that's fine. I think that's a worthy argument if you can back it up and if you can evidence it. So whichever side you took, it's about learning to be persuasive, back up your ideas, really try and prove that you are right with whatever answer you are offering here. Okay, so let's have a look now at the actual order that these figures fell in chronologically, historically, and who they are. So I'll meet you on the next slide. Right, so this infographic kind of illustrates for you the history of some of the world's greatest speeches. This is, again, not an exhaustive list. There have been many, many really impactful speeches that have occurred over time. But this is some of the key speakers and the time in which they were making their speeches to have a look at. So you can see modern day is up here, and the past is back here. This is way in the past. And these are speeches that arguably changed the world. So it's a history of rhetoric from Shakespeare to Thunberg. So when we use that word rhetoric is like the art of persuasive speech, the ability to make a speech to persuade others and to influence what's happening. And we've got some of our earliest examples is Julius Caesar. and Shakespeare a little bit further along. Obviously, I mentioned earlier the Greeks, that would be way back here. Okay, we've got key speakers like the American President Abraham Lincoln, right through to Pankhurst, who was a suffragette, so she was campaigning for the rights of women to have greater equality and a voice to vote, etc. Okay, now what you will notice if you have a look at this is not all of these speakers have necessarily changed the world for the better. We go from an example like Pankhurst, who I think was, a significant figure, and as a woman, I believe was really, really important and to be respected for the work that she did in giving women the right to vote, to other characters like Hitler, who we may disapprove of his politics, we may hopefully disapprove of his value system. However, he is a very competent speaker. He was able to write really rousing speeches that did bring the people together. And of course, this is part of the danger of persuasive writing. Those who are talented at persuasive writing can persuade people to do things that are perhaps immoral or against our better judgment. And such is the power of the ability to use words in order to manipulate others. So when we're looking at persuasive speech writing, they're not necessarily always going to be examples of speeches that we would want to replicate the values of, but what we are learning is how they're doing it, how the mechanics of their language and their imagery and their way of speaking to the people can be used effectively to manipulate us into sharing a viewpoint. Of course, your task will be to try and use that skill, use that ability for a greater good, rather than to do harm. And as I've mentioned, Winston Churchill, so you can see the order that these figures fell in from Shakespeare to Hitler to Churchill to Barack Obama up here. A really significant figure in American history because he's obviously the first black president, really sort of representing for the people for the first time a degree of equality between the races. And America has a long history of segregation and separation of the races, and so that moment where Barack Obama gives his speech in his inauguration as president is really important because this is a massive moment in American history. And as we look through some of the further figures, we come to Trump and Greta Thunberg as our modern day examples of highly persuasive speech makers. Now, you can have whatever opinion you wish about these two. You may not entirely approve of their speech making. And again, this isn't really about politics. This is about understanding how language is being used to manipulate and persuade people. You can have whatever political views you wish on this, okay? It's just about understanding that these people are considered by many to be persuasive. Like it or not, they may have won elections, they may have accumulated votes. So they are certainly doing something with their language use that makes them a persuasive speaker to some degree, okay? So remember, we're separating out what we think politically from what we can say analytically about the language that they are using. Right, so now you will need to check the answers on here versus the order that you put the figures in and how you named them for the starter activity, okay? So grab a green pen and mark your answers. Did you get the figures right, and did you get them in the right order? Okay everyone, so I would love to be able to show you some video clips now of some amazing speeches that have been delivered throughout history. Unfortunately, there is a lag when I try to live record like this, so what I'm going to do instead is suggest that you go and look up some examples of fantastic speeches that have been made throughout history. You may wish to look up, for example, Martin Luther King on YouTube and watch his I Have a Dream famous speech. You may also wish to look up some other examples like Barack Obama's speech at his inauguration when he took over the presidency in America. You also might want to go and look at some of Greta Thunberg's speeches. Okay, so you can YouTube all of those, and I will try and drop links in to the descriptions for the videos to help you to find some of those or save them to our playlist for you, okay? So I will try and do that. But another video link that I'd like you to try and have a look at it's called Watch Mojo, Mojo, and if you look up Watch Mojo Greatest Persuasive Speeches, it gives a really nice historical oversight of some of the momentous moments in speech writing. Okay, so go and explore those videos now and then meet me back on this video afterwards. Okay, so at the very start of the lesson, I explained to you that one of the things that we were going to be doing today was looking at genre, audience and purpose. So we call this the GAP, and this is basically an acronym that helps us remember what we should try and understand to appreciate a piece of persuasive writing. So when we talk about the genre, what we are talking about is what kind of text it is. Is it a speech? Is it a letter or a piece of journalism? Our audience is who you think it is aimed at, who are they trying to convince to do what? And the purpose is the what. It's why has it been written or delivered? What do they want to change, and what actions are they demanding? Now, if you understand the genre, the audience and the purpose, you can have a pretty accurate oversight as to what the whole point of the speech has been. So it's a really important skill to get you trained in, is identifying the genre, the audience and the purpose. I'm going to ask you now to copy down into your books the key questions that I've put here for each. These are the questions that you should look at to try and guide your analysis of any extracts. We're going to put this to the test shortly in the next slide, and I'm going to show you some extracts from famous speeches, and I'm going to ask you to try and identify the genre, the audience and the purpose for each of those. So make notes now based on what you can see on the slide here. You need to copy down the key information about what genre it is, what audience is and what purpose is. Obviously our figure in the centre here is Greta, with her climate change banner being held there. So we will be looking at some of Greta's speech writing in future lessons. So start now by copying these down and then pause the video, and when you're ready we will have a look at some famous speeches and try and identify what these are. Okay? Okay, so our first example that we are going to have a look at now is from Martin Luther King Jr. So this is the famous I Have a Dream speech, and this is a short extract from it that you can see here. And I'm going to ask you to see if you can now work out what the genre, the audience and the purpose is for this extract. So when I say genre, you can have a look here at the slide for the prompts. What type of text do you think it's coming from? And what type of non-fiction would you classify it as? Then for your audience, who do you feel it is being read for or aimed at? And for the purpose, why do you think it was written? So you need an answer for each of those. What genre is it? Who is the audience? And what is the purpose? Okay, and you will need to make those three answers really clearly laid out, and I would put a subtitle of I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King, and then write your answers for G, A and P below it. Genre, audience and purpose. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you and you need to write down your answers and then pause the video. Okay, so now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now, I am not delivering that anywhere nearly as well as Martin Luther King would have. And please do go and look that clip up on YouTube as well. You can watch it there. So your job now is pause the video and write down what is the genre, what is the audience, what is the purpose. Okay, so hopefully you have now had a go at working out what the genre, audience and purpose would be. And I've just displayed for you here the answers. So the genre, it is of course a persuasive speech. The audience, citizens of America. You may well have known that if you know anything about his background. Don't worry if you didn't know. And the purpose, to persuade people at the time to be aware of the need for racial equality and motivate them to act towards achieving it. So his whole point in delivering his speech was to kind of encourage everybody to see the races as equal and of deserving of that equality. He's also trying to rally people together to stand up for what they believe in, and to fight for what is right justice, which is the equality of the races, and to not be silent about that any longer, because he sees their silence, people not speaking out for what they believe is right, as being a way of kind of condoning segregation and supremacy. Supremacy means like elevating one race above the other, so the white man as the supremacist, and anybody else as being inferior. Okay, so I've sort of guided you through that first one. I'm now going to be more hands-off and let you have a go at the following ones, okay? So you've got 2 more examples that I want you to have a go at now. Okay, so our next example is Anne Frank, and this is from the Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank. So I think a little bit of background that you will need to know before you attempt to find out the genre, audience and purpose of this extract. So Anne Frank was a young teenage girl, okay, and she was growing up at a time in which war was very prevalent. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a little bit of information about her here that we can read through so that you understand her background and context before you try and analyse what she said. So Anne Frank, you can see her full name there and her date of birth. What you need to know is that she was a Jewish girl whose diary of her family's 2 years in hiding during the German occupation of the Netherlands became a classic of war literature. Okay, so early in the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler, Anne's father, Otto Frank, a German businessman, took his wife and 2 daughters to live in Amsterdam. In 1941, after German forces occupied the Netherlands, Anne was compelled to transfer from a public school to a Jewish one. On June 12, 1942, she received a red and white plaid diary for her 13th birthday, the day she began writing in the book. I hope I will be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support. And this is Anne here, you can see. So when Anne's sister Margot was faced with deportation, supposedly to a forced labour camp, the Franks went into hiding. In the backroom office and warehouse of Otto Frank's food products business. With the aid of a few non-Jewish friends, among them, I have no idea how to pronounce this, by the way, Mayup, okay, who smuggled in food and other supplies. The Frank family and 4 other Jews, Hermann and August van Pels and their son Peter and Fritz Pfeffer, lived confined into the secret annex. You can actually go and visit the house as well. You can go and see where she was staying. Really cramped quarters, considering the number of the family members that were hiding out in the secret part of the building. So it was a secret annex. It's part of the building that was hidden from immediate view. But if you moved part of the deck or aside, you could actually get in and enter up into this secret part of the building. So the family was sort of protected by locals there, and this is really important because this is where Anne writes her diary, and she's writing from an experience of basically being in hiding, having to hide from the Nazis who would have persecuted her and her family because of their Jewish ancestry. Of course, Hitler was persecuting the Jews because it was part of his campaign and mission to create a society that were predominantly Aryan, and he was victimising anyone who didn't fit his ideology, so his vision of what society should look like. And Anne and her family were subject to that. I'm not going to read you too much more of that because it's a really interesting story in and of its own right, and you should go away and research that yourself. What you need to understand from it is that this is a girl who is living her life as a young teenager in hiding, and because of the persecution that Hitler and the Nazi regime had put in place. Okay. So now you know a little bit about the background of Anne Frank. We're going to have a look at the extract here. So it's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Now, I think if you have looked into Anne Frank and you've listened to what I've just read to you about Anne Frank, you may just start to appreciate how remarkable those words are. You know, this is coming from a girl whose family are persecuted, and yet she believes that at heart people are essentially good. So your job now, with that in the back of your mind, is to try and work out what the genre, the audience and the purpose is. Use the notes in the blue box here to help you, to give you some ideas. Pause the video and then I'm going to display the answers, so pause now. Right, so time to have a look at the answers, and you'll need your green pen to go through the feedback for this. So the genre, historical literary non-fiction because it is a diary. And the audience was herself, but also the wider world, so beyond occupied Germany. Her hope had been, and indeed the Netherlands, and her hope had been that her voice would finally get out there, that she would be able to confide her deepest feelings in her diary, but with the hope that perhaps somebody else might find this and read it. And the purpose, to display her personal life struggles through a captivating diary, which not only educates readers on the effects of World War II, but it's also giving us an insight into what it is to be a teenage girl as well. Okay, so any answers that were around approximating these would be excellent. If you didn't get all of those points down, add them in your green pen now. Okay, and your final extract before we develop this idea a little bit further is from Greta Thunberg addressing Davos. So this is where world leaders would meet to discuss issues over the direction of big countries in terms of economic progress, etc. Okay, so she went to speak to some of these great leaders of some of the most powerful countries in the world, and this is what she said. So the context of this is that Greta Thunberg is a climate activist. She believes very strongly that we have a duty to protect our world, and that our world currently is at risk of serious damage from climate change, irreversible damage. And this is what she said: "Our house is on fire. At Davos, people like to talk about success, but financial success has come with a price tag, and on the climate we have failed, and unless we recognise the failures of our system, there will be unspoken suffering." She certainly does not pull any punches there, okay? She's very outspoken. She's making it very clear what she thinks about climate change. And again, for this one, I'm going to ask you to work out, what genre is this? Greta Thunberg addressing Davos. Who's her audience? And what is the purpose? Why does she write this? Okay, so get your answers down now and pause the video. Okay, so some of the answers you could have had for that one is that the genre is clearly a speech. She is directing this at her audience of world leaders, and the purpose to persuade them to take more action on climate change, to basically elevate the importance of climate change above financial success, as she says here. And people at this convention at Davos like to talk about financial success because they are usually representatives of some of the wealthiest countries in the world. However, as she points out, this comes with a price tag on the climate, and she says explicitly that we have failed on that front. So her hope is to challenge world leaders and those who run some of the most powerful countries to reevaluate whether financial success is worth damaging the world for. Okay, and pause the video. Okay, so you should now have been through your answers for Martin Luther King, Anne Frank and Greta Thunberg, and added any points that you missed in green pen. So we're now going to move on and think about why literary non-fiction might be important. So last lesson we looked at the different forms of non-fiction, including literary non-fiction, and today we have looked at genre, audience and purpose, and why those are important because they unlock really the whole point of the existence of the speech in the first place, or the piece of persuasive writing. Now we're going to try and work out how those two ideas come together, so literary non-fiction and genre, audience and purpose. And we're going to think about this piece of historical non-fiction and compare it with the one on the next slide. So I'm going to read this through to you, and I'm going to ask you to try and think about why this kind of literary non-fiction might be important. So literary non-fiction is factual writing about usually historical events or somebody's personal experience, but it also puts into that insight into a character or a personality, and the inner thoughts and feelings that that person went through as well. So it isn't just a history textbook that gives you the information about an event, this happened then that happened. It's something which also gives you an insight into the character's thoughts and feelings, usually because it's written firsthand through somebody's experience of those events. So we're going to read through the information here, and I'll try and explain a little bit of the background for this to you, and then we're going to compare what's written here with what's written on the next slide. Both are about the same event, but they have a different style of writing. Both are non-fiction pieces. One is literary and one isn't. So this is a piece of historical non-fiction. Okay, so this is about recording the facts, what event led to what event. The following is a historical account of Rosa Parks. Rosa Louise Macaulay Parks, February the 4th, 1913 to October 24th, 2005, was an African-American civil rights activist whom the US Congress called the First Lady of Civil Rights. On December the 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Parks refused to obey bus driver James F. Lake's order that she give up her seat to make room for a white passenger. Okay, so that's an extract from a historical factual piece of writing about Rosa Parks, and as it tells us there, she was referred to as the First Lady of Civil Rights. The Civil Rights Movement was the movement to push for a reform of the way that people of different races were being treated in America at the time. So it was a fight against segregation, which is where black people and white people were separated out because white people were seen as superior and more deserving than those of other ethnicities. Okay, and what was so shocking about Rosa Parks' action was that she refused to obey this bus driver, who ordered her to give up her seat to make room for a white passenger. And she refused to do that on the grounds that her life and rights were equal to anybody else's. So she made a stand by trying to represent for all people of colour that they are equal to any of the rest of us, that there was no need for her to act as if she was inferior to anybody else. Okay, so that's a bit about the background, and what we've just read is purely factual account of some of the information about this woman and the event in which she changed history by protesting, by not giving up her seat. We're now going to have a look at another slide which will recount a similar version of events, but from a different perspective. Okay, so this time I'm going to show you a piece from Coretta Scott King's autobiographical account of the same incident. So we're still talking about Rosa Parks, and I'm going to read this bit to you, and I want you to think about how this example of literary non-fiction is different to the historical piece of non-fiction on the previous slide. What does this one add or do that the historical one didn't? And that's the key question at the bottom there. Okay, so as I read, you're thinking about the bit below. Okay, so serene after his inner struggle, Martin joined me in our sitting room. We sat together talking about the prospects for the success of the protest. We were both filled with doubt. Attempted boycotts have failed in Montgomery and other cities. We finally decided that if the boycott was 60% effective, we would be doing all right and we would be satisfied to have made a good start. Okay, so What the last piece of historical non-fiction gave us was a breakdown of events and dates and people and what happened and when. What this piece gives us is a first-person account of a time in history in which the civil rights movement was underway. And I want you to now have a go at thinking about what this literary non-fiction gives us that the historical one didn't. So how does seeing things from the perspective of somebody firsthand add to what we understand of a factual event and time in history? Okay, so you're now going to try and answer this question here, and I want you to try and do that on your own, and then I'll talk you through the feedback. So pause the video and add that in now. Okay, so as you reflect on what this piece of writing does that the historical one didn't do, one of the most important things about literary non-fiction, as we saw with the Diary of Anne Frank, is that they add insight into the inner thoughts and feelings of the people who really experience these events in history. And the reason that that matters is it gives us greater understanding of the human impact of historical events. And when we're looking at extracts in English, we need to bear in mind this very historical side of what we do, which is to appreciate how emotion is being displayed and what that tells us about history that we couldn't learn just through facts, events, dates, etc. Okay, so one of the things that you can add for your answer to this in green pen is that literary non-fiction gives us an insight into the psychology of people, and this gives us the human insight into historical events and not just the pure facts and statistics about what happened when. Okay, so I'm just going to move myself for you. There we go. I need to put myself further away. I'm now going to give you a gap fill exercise to test out your understanding of what literary non-fiction actually is. So don't forget, literary non-fiction is writing about factual events, but giving us insight into a character or a first-hand perspective of what happened. So as you can see, I've put the first blank in for you here, and I want you to pause the video and see if you can work out which words go in the other blank. So you need to read what's on the screen here and work out which of these words you would put in the corresponding blanks. Okay, so pause the video and have a go at doing that now. Okay, so your answers should have looked a little bit like this. So to read the full thing through for you, literary non-fiction is important because it can give us extra details that we may not get from historical non-fiction. We may learn about the people's personalities or the culture and atmosphere at the time. A purely factual record may not capture this information. Literary non-fiction can also interest the reader in a way other non-fiction would not, because it uses more original and carefully crafted language. Okay, so what I hope you'll have understood by the end of this lesson is that literary non-fiction serves like a unique role in our understanding of history, and some of the greatest speeches and bits of persuasive writing that you can find out there, things like Anne Frank's diary and the memoirs of the civil rights movement, are so important because not only are they hugely persuasive in terms of the way that they've been written to try and communicate to people the necessity of change, whether that's for racial equality or whether that is for the end of a regime like Nazism, fascism. What we learn from these are the real human impacts that these events have had on people. And part of the reason that that is so powerful for us as a reader is because it shows us what the emotions attached to these events really are and the passion with which people feel them. Any good piece of persuasive writing needs to convey passion, and that's going to be something that we'll talk about when we look at Greta Thunberg's work in more close detail. And it's something that you will need to challenge when you write your letter to an MP on the topic of climate change. Okay, so these are all skills that you will need to have in the back of your head as you prepare to create your assessment on that. Alright guys, so we are nearly done. I will meet you on the next slide. So you have now practiced identifying the genre, the audience and the purpose of some persuasive speech extracts in order to understand what they're about and why they've been written. I'm now going to test you out on how many of the great persuaders' causes you can identify. So on the image here, you can see many different persuasive speakers. So these are all people who have made significant persuasive speeches at some point in history. And you're going to answer task number 1, 2 and 3 below. And you need to try and work out, number 1, how many of these great persuaders courses you can identify. By that I mean the topic, so what they're talking about, what they're persuading us to think. Number 2, do we have to agree with someone to find them persuasive? So reflect back on what I was saying at the beginning of the lesson about separating politics from our ability to understand somebody's use of language. And number 3, how important do you think it is to learn about the legacy of persuasive writing and speech? So you will need written answers for each of those questions. You need to pause the video in a second and try and write your answers down. For any of you who aren't sure on some of these figures, I'm just going to summarise for you who they all are. And we are going to start at the top over here. So this is Pankhurst making her speeches about the suffragette movement and the right for women to vote and have greater equality in society. At the time, so this is early part of the 20th century, women didn't have the same rights as men in England and couldn't have voted. Many of them were not even educated to the level that women these days would be. So Pankhurst was fighting for their right to have their voice heard and to have the right to make decisions about how the country was led. We've got here Martin Luther King representing the civil rights movement in America. We've got Adolf Hitler over here, obviously a proponent of fascism and Nazi ideals. You've got George Orwell down here, writer, propaganda writer and novelist who wrote 1984. You've got Emma Watson, who has made some significant speeches about female equality and women's rights in the modern day. Barack Obama and Greta Thunberg, Nelson Mandela and Boris Johnson and Trump. Okay, so if you're not sure what any of these figures might have been speaking about in a persuasive manner, what I suggest you do is you go and search up on YouTube and Google these characters and type in their name followed by persuasive speeches and read up on the kind of examples of persuasive speeches some of these characters have made. Use that to then help you answer these questions. So how many of the causes can you identify what they're speaking about? Do we have to agree with someone to find them persuasive? And how important do you think it is to learn about the legacy of persuasive speech writing? Don't forget that word legacy means like the history of persuasive writing and speeches. Okay? Okay, so at this point you should have gone and looked at some of those famous speeches by some of the significant figures on the last slide and answered the questions that I set below that. Your next task is going to be to reflect on what you've learned this lesson. So this will be the end of your lesson and you need to just write a short review in order to answer the question down here. So how has this lesson developed your understanding of persuasive writing? I want you to think about including the words that I have bullet pointed here for you. These are the things that we have learnt about today. The legacy of persuasive speeches, so this history of great speech making that's come from the Greeks through to Julius Caesar, to Shakespeare, up to the modern day era and Greta Thunberg, etc. Okay, we've also learnt about genre, audience and purpose and how understanding those helps us better appreciate what a speech is about. And finally, what literary non-fiction is and why it matters. So don't forget that historical non-fiction will inform us about dates and events. Literary non-fiction gives us a first-person account of what has happened and some insight into the human costs of history. So your final reflection is to answer the question, how has this lesson developed your understanding of persuasive writing? For a perfect answer, you want to try and include each of those bullet points in your answer. Okay, guys? So thank you for bearing with me with the video. So much harder to do it in this context and with you. I can't see you and have your responses back, so I know what you understand and what you don't. I know it's so weird learning in this format, but I really appreciate you sticking with it and trying to improve your knowledge of English by watching these videos. So thank you very much for that, guys. As usual, please get in touch with me. You can please subscribe to the channel, but also message me using the usual forms. Okay, so you've got my email, you've also got Show My Homework, so contact me via those platforms. All right, guys, take care.